name is Sutton, and I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And I want to thank those of you here at SUNY Fredonia for the opportunity to come give a talk as part of the Young Philosophers Lecture Series. My topic today is the too many thinkers problem. And so I want to start by describing the too many thinkers problem. So everyone agrees that people think, or philosophers sometimes like to use the term persons think. Some philosophers in the tradition of John Locke think that persons are not identical to their bodies. Well, when we talk about a person and a body, we're talking about two things and not one. Now, we said persons think. It seems like bodies can think too. Why couldn't they? Bodies have brains, they have a nervous system, they have all the necessary equipment for thinking. So this leads to the conclusion that in your chair right now there are two thinkers, a person and a body. And that conclusion is supposed to be just too weird. Right? So now I've couched the problem of too many thinkers as a problem for people in the tradition of John Locke who think that persons and bodies are two things, not one. But a variation of the too many thinkers problem arises for competing views. So, for example, philosophers who call themselves perdurantist think that you are, as a person, you are made up of, you are the sum of what they call time slices. So you now, you in the next moment, you tomorrow, and all these time slices add up to make you. So when I look at you sitting in your chair, I'm only looking at part of you as a person. I'm looking at your time slice. Now, for the perdurantist, in your chair right now is both part of you and a time slice. So there's two things competing for the title of thinker, or it seems like there might be two thinkers. Another theory that has the too many thinkers problem is, ironically, animalism. And animalism is the view that a person is just another name for a human being, a human organism. And I say it's ironic that the animalists have the too many thinkers problem because oftentimes animalists use the too many thinkers problem to rule out the Lockean view. But so one way that the animalist has this problem is that it seems like brains think, and you're clearly not the same thing as your brain. You're a lot more than your brain. So your brain, for example, is a lot smaller than you are. So it seems like in your chair there are two thinking things, two thinkers, a brain and you. All right, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus in on the problem as stated for the Neo-Lockean view that there's a person and a body sitting in your chair thinking right now. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the too many thinkers problem in the philosophical literature has usually been targeted against the Neo-Lockean view. But I wanted to say up front that the solution that I'm going to offer is also a solution that's available for these other varieties of the too many thinkers problem. All right, so to sum up the problem, if the person is not identical to the body, then there are two thinkers in your chair. Right? And my thesis is going to be that if there are two thinkers, then there's not a problem. Right? Maybe it's counterintuitive, but there's no substantive problem there if there are two thinkers in your chair. All right, some preliminaries. First, I want to assume a physicalist account of persons. I'm going to assume that that people are physical beings. The reason I'm going to do this is because the too many thinkers problem is a problem for physicalists. If you are a dualist and you think that you are a non-physical soul that's somehow associated with a body, then you have a really easy solution to the too many thinkers problem. You say, souls think, bodies don't, there's only one thinker in my chair. So I'm going to assume a physicalist account of person since that's who's dealing with this problem. All right, I want to just recap. Those of you who came to the earlier talk, you know the motivations for a neo-Lockean view of persons, which is the view that the person and the body are two different things, two objects, not one. But just a quick recap. So if we understand a person as a thinking thing that has psychological properties that make a person, then it's possible that the body and the person not come apart in certain cases, which gives us reason to think that they're two things rather than one. So, for example, imagine that a woman gets in a terrible car accident and goes into a persistent vegetative state, and she never wakes up. In that kind of situation, it seems like there's no longer a thinking thing there with psychological properties, with beliefs and desires and thoughts. At the time of the accident, the person goes out of existence. But the body is still alive. Right? And because there's this difference between the person and the body, then we have reason to think that the body and the person are two different things. All right. I'm also going to assume that the person and the body share parts that underlie their thinking. And there's three ways that the body and the person could share parts. One way is that the body and the person could have all of their parts in common at some breakdown of the parts. So, for example, it might be that the body and the person have all of the same cells or atoms or something like that. A second way that the person and the body could share parts, it might be that the person is actually whatever's directly responsible for the thinking. Derek Parfit has espoused this sort of view recently. So maybe just the brain, or just the brain and the nervous system are what's responsible for the psychological activity of the person, and so that's the person. And in that case, the person is a part of the body. Right? So they share parts, but not all of their parts. A third view, and this one was first suggested by Carol Rovain and more recently by David Chalmers and Andy Clark, is that the mind, the thinking thing, extends beyond the body in some way. That part of the content of our thoughts and beliefs is made up by things that are outside of our body, like the calendar in your phone serves a similar function as your parts of your brain if you're trying to remember when you said you would meet your friend. Right, so that's a third way that the person and the body might share parts. In that case, the person is the bigger thing and the body is a part of the person. All right, so I'm going to stay neutral on these ways among these three views. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that the person and the body share parts. All right, I'm going to argue that the thinking of the body and the person is non-summative. And this word non-summative is something that I'm coining for the purposes of this philosophical argument. So what do I mean by non-summative? Basically, actually before we get to the more technical definition, the idea is that the thinking of your body, when we're counting the number of thoughts in your chair, if the thoughts of your body and the thoughts of you as a person are non-summative, then when we add those together, it's not going to increase the quantity. So if we take let's say that you're thinking about your sister, and you as a person are thinking about your sister, the body's also thinking about the sister. There's one thought there and not two. And that's what I mean by non-summative. But here's a more technical definition. Right? Thing T is non-summative in cases in which the amount of T had by X and the amount of T had by Y, so X might be the body and Y might be the person, taken together is the same as the sum of the two, minus the amount of T that is shared by X and Y. So, for example, the amount of thinking that's shared by the person and the body. Right? Let me give you a more ordinary example of this. The weight of your body and the weight of your arm is non-summative. So if, and I gave this example in the earlier talk, if you weigh 150 pounds and your left arm weighs 9 pounds, then to find out how much your body and your arm weigh together, we're not going to add the 150. We're not going to sum the 150 and the 9 to get 159. Instead, what we would do is we would sum them to 159 and then subtract the shared amount, so subtract the shared 9 pounds to come up with the answer that your arm and your body together weigh 150 pounds. All right, now not everybody who worries about, not everybody who puts forward the too many thinkers problem worries about there being too much thinking or a duplication of thoughts, but some people do. So I want to contrast my claim with a couple people who have worried about there being too much thinking. David Mackey in 1999 said that Neo-Lockeans do not, quote, deal with the simplest objection of all, that it just seems crazy to suppose that there are two psychological lives going on where I am now. And more recently, Dean Zimmerman wrote that if there are 2 or 3 thinkers here, then there are 2 or 3 pains that have to be taken into account in utilitarian calculations, for instance, and 2 thinkers thinking I am in pain. Now, I partially agree with Zimmerman, so I agree with him that there are 2 thinkers thinking I am in pain, but I disagree with him that there are 2 pains. I'm going to argue that there's only 1 pain. All right, on to the argument, the supervenience argument against too much thinking. And what I want to do is I just want to run through the argument, give you 4 premises and a conclusion, and then we'll go back through it more slowly, one premise at a time. But just first to give you an overview. All right, premise 1, where object A and object B share a supervenience space, and when we come back to premise 1, we'll talk about what a supervenience space is. Where they share a supervenience space for X, X is not summative across the shared parts of object A and object B. Premise 2, a person and her body share a supervenience space for thinking. Premise 3, thinking is not summative across the shared parts of a person and her body. Premise 4, whenever something is not summative across shared parts, there is not too much of that thing. And on to our conclusion. Therefore, there is not too much thinking if both the body and the person think. All right, let's take them one at a time. And I'll go ahead and warn you, the argument for premise 1 is the most involved and complex. All right, premise 1, where object A and object B share a supervenient space for X, X is not summative. All right, so what is a supervenient space? I'll start with a definition of supervenience, and then I'm going to give you some examples. So something X supervenes on some other thing Y if there can't be a change in X without a change in Y. So in the philosophy of mind, it's a popular view that our mental life, our thoughts, supervene on what's going on in our brain. So the idea is that there can't be a change in what I'm thinking unless there's a change in my brain processes or the neurons that are firing, or some sort of change in my brain. There can't be a change in my thoughts without a change in the brain activity that underlies those thoughts. And there's several ways that this supervenience claim can be cashed out. And so the reason I decided to use this technical term of supervenience is because it's going to capture a variety of positions in the philosophy of mind. So, for example, some philosophers think that our thoughts so if I'm thinking about my sister, that's just one way of talking about certain neurons firing. And that thought is identical to the neurons firing. Another another variety of supervenience in the philosophy of mind would be to say that, well, maybe there's multiple ways, multiple different types of brain activity that can produce the same thought. Okay? But that's still consistent with supervenience. Also, functionalism in the philosophy of mind. This is the idea that there can't be a change in my thoughts unless there's a change in either the causes or the effects of my thoughts, the functional role that my thoughts play. Okay. All right, so let's take, but I've stated a premise not specific to philosophy of mind, even though that's what we're most interested in. I'm going to argue for it in general terms, based on the understanding of what supervenience is. All right, so remember, X supervenes on parts P. Parts P might be parts of your brain, for example, if and only if there cannot be a change in X without a change in P or their interrelation. All right, now I'd like you to imagine, and we could call this premise 0, because I'm going to draw on this in the argument that's going to follow. But I'd like you to imagine two things. First, imagine that parts P compose object A, and that X supervenes on parts P. So we have an object A composed of parts P, and those parts P are a supervenience space for some X. Right, now I'd like you to imagine that object A becomes a part of a larger object B. But object A remains intact with the same parts P interrelated in the same way. Okay, so we have object A, now a part of larger object B, and both object A and object B have parts P as parts. All right, first step, assume for reductio that premise 1 is false. So assume for reductio ad absurdum that where object A and object B share a supervenience space for X, X is summative. Right, so imagine that premise 1 is false. In that case, when object A becomes a part of object B, X will increase twofold. Thus, there would be a change in X without a change in parts P or their interrelation, in which case X would not supervene on parts P and their interrelation. Okay? Because remember, what it is for X to supervene on parts P is just for it to be true that there cannot be a change in X without a change in the parts that it supervenes on. But by hypothesis, remember I asked you to imagine that X supervenes on parts P. So we've come across a contradiction. X cannot both supervene and not supervene on parts P. And since we've come across a contradiction, we're able to reject what was assumed for reductio and conclude that premise 1 is true. That is, X remains the same whether the parts it supervenes on are parts of one object or two. All right, so that's premise 1. That's the most difficult premise. So let's move on. Okay, so where they share a supervenience space for X, X is not summative. Premise 2. A person and her body share a supervenience space for thinking. All right, the second premise is controversial. So, for example, substance dualist would reject premise 2. They would say that a person thinks in virtue of having a soul. But I'm going to help myself to this premise because premise 2 is needed to get the too many thinkers problem off the ground in the first place. Right? So if the reason that we worry about there being two thinkers in your chair is because the body has a brain just like the person. So, so it's easy to take this premise in responding to the too many thinkers problem. Right? So, premise 3. Thinking is not summative across the shared parts of a person and her body. And premise 3, if you accept premise 1 and premise 2, premise 3 follows. Premise 4. Whenever something is not summative across shared parts, there's not too much of that thing. Whenever something is not summative across shared parts, there is not too much of that thing. Now, my claim here of not too much is imprecise, but I think it can be established nonetheless. So, people who have put forward the too many thinkers problem have given us a target number of how much thinking and how many thoughts there should be. So, in David Mackey's example, he said, if you think that the body thinks and the person think, then you're going to have 2 psychological lives going on in the area where you're sitting. But he said, but he thinks that's not right. It's obvious that there's only 1 psychological life, right? So that's our target number, 1 psychological life. Premises 1 through 3 have established that there's only 1 psychological life because the person and the body share a supervenient space for their psychological life. So those psychological lives are non-summative. That is, we can take the 1 and the 1 and then subtract the amount that's shared, which is 1, and we end up with 1 psychological life. We could do the same thing with pains. Because pains come from a shared supervenient space, they're not summative. That means that there's only 1 pain shared between the person and the body. And that was the target number that the critics gave us. So there's not too much of the thinking according to the critics in terms. All right, that brings us to our conclusion. Therefore, there is not too much thinking if both the body and the person think. Now, I mentioned earlier that this worry about too much thinking is had by some, but not all, people who put forward the too many thinkers problem. The most famous proponent of the too many thinkers problem is a philosopher named Erik Olson. And he's not worried about there being too much thinking or too many thoughts. He is instead worried about there being too many things that think, too many thinkers. So let's take a look at his objection. He calls it the overcrowding objection. So he says, I agree with you, there's only 1 train of thought, but there are still 2 thinkers, which common sense tells us is wrong. I want to give 2 responses to the overcrowding objection. The first is that there is a way to make sense, there's a way to sensibly say that there's only 1 thinker in your chair. Even on my view in which technically there's 2, we can still say in everyday discourse that you and your body count as 1 thinker. And I claim that this is not an ad hoc metaphysical trick, rather that this is continuous with how we talk about part-whole cases with ordinary objects. So how many of you you've ever used those travel mugs in your car? They've got the lid, the spill-proof lid on them. Right, so let's imagine you have one of those in your car. And we can ask, how many things in your car hold coffee? And the travel mug is 1. But here's a second thing in your car that holds coffee. The tumbler of the travel mug, so you take off the lid, what you're left with is a tumbler, and that tumbler is not identical to the whole travel mug. The tumbler is smaller. It's a part of the travel mug, but they're not identical. So technically, there's 2 things that hold coffee in your car. In fact, if you believe, some people believe in arbitrary undetached parts. for example, they believe in the existence of the bottom half of the tumbler. So maybe there's more than two. But there's at least two things in your car that hold coffee. But if I say to you, how many things in your coffee hold, how many things in your car hold coffee? Because we're about to go on a trip, and I want to know if there's something for each of us to drink coffee out of. The proper response is there's one, because the tumbler and the travel mug together function as one coffee holder. Right? So in everyday discourse, we sensibly restrict quantification and count parts and wholes as one when they function as one. And I suggest that you and your body should count as one thinker for the purposes of everyday discourse. So when we ask how many thinkers were in the Vienna Circle, we're interested in how many unique thought lives are there, not how many things that think. Now, Eric Olson is familiar with this response. It's not the response is not original with me, but I think it's an important response to show that there is a way to say genuinely that there's only one thinking thing in your chair, even though there's another technical sense in which there's two. Eric Olson has responded to this response, and he says that the mere existence of the hypothesis that we count thinkers, in his original text he said philosophers, but I went back to thinkers since that's our example, that we count thinkers by a relation other than numerical identity does little to make it easier to believe that there are two numerically different thinkers sitting there and reading this now. Right? So the idea is, okay, so you can sensibly say that there's one thinker in your chair, but what Olson cares about is that there not be any way in which you can say that there's two thinkers in your chair. Right? So he wants to get that off the table. And the reason that he wants to get it off the table is because it offends our pre-theoretical notions of how many thinkers are in your chair. It offends common sense. And so my response to this is that common sense is unclear on this question of how many thinkers are in your chair. And common sense is an unreliable guide in this case. And here's why I think that. So I want you to consider these, I want you to consider the common sense or pre-theoretical answers to the following questions. Question 1, do brains think? Common sense says yes. Question 2, do you think? Common sense says yes. Question 3, are you more than your brain? And question 3 is a pre-theoretical way to get at the question of numerical identity. So are you more than your brain? Common sense says, yes, I'm more than my brain. So we take these results from common sense and put them together, and we get that there are at least two things in your chair, thinking things in your chair, your brain and you. Now, I gladly concede that common sense also says that if we ask the question, how many thinkers are in your chair, common sense will answer 1. Right? But what I think this shows is that common sense is internally inconsistent on the question of how many things think. And because it's internally inconsistent, it's an unreliable guide. And so I think we should stop trying to please common sense, because common sense isn't going to be happy with any answer to this question. Okay, on to the conclusion. So if both the person and the body think, there's not too much thinking. The shared thinking between a person and a body is a natural extension of partial overlap.